All right, welcome back. Here we are at Chapter 2, Workforce Safety and Wellness. This is a really important chapter that's oftentimes overlooked or taken lightly. I encourage you to take to heart many of the things that are going to be discussed in this chapter because they can mean the difference in a very short career as an EMT or a very long, happy, prosperous career as an EMT. So it's really important to point out that in order for us to do an effective job as an EMT, we have to take care of ourselves. This is really, really important if we're planning on taking care of others. If we're a wreck, we're not going to be much help to someone that really, really needs us in a time of crisis. It's also important to recognize the threats to your health, safety, and well-being ahead of time, and that way you can begin to lessen them. You probably never make them completely go away, but we can begin to try to lessen them to where that they have their impact on our lives isn't as great, and to where that we're able to manage them. The thing is, though, is personal neglect can actually lead to serious health and safety problems. So just thinking this stuff is going to go away or it will work itself out or it will get better is not a good approach to that. It's really important that we speak up, that we take a handle on that and manage our own safety, our own well-being, and not just leave it to the forces of nature. Of course, there's going to be some environmental dangers, some human-made threats that can act on our ability to do our job. Then we have the mental and physical stresses that can build up over time and take their toll. And this is what I'm talking about when we just try to kind of let nature take its course as opposed to speaking up and trying to manage those stressors and those stressful things. Mental and physical stresses will build up over time before you know it. If you try to just ignore those things that are happening, it just won't work. It's really important that you take it seriously because your emotional well-being is closely connected to your patients. And this is especially true of those times during high-stress calls. So if your mental well-being is exhausted and beat up and beat down, you're not going to be effective at taking care of patients when they need you to be at your best because they're having their worst moments. So, your health is a combination of your physical, mental, and emotional well-being all working together. Long-term physical, mental, or emotional stress can make health problems much worse or increase your risk of developing them. Not every stress, though, is necessarily harmful. Sometimes there are some good stresses, believe it or not, and those are called eustresses. These are healthy forms of stress that can create a positive response, kind of makes things kind of work out. Eustresses can improve your focus and energy in the short term, and they can boost your job satisfaction and self-image over time. Honestly, that's what we're going to expose you to in the classroom. We're going to expose you to a lot of eustresses. You're going to get stressed. It's going to be difficult. You're going to succeed, and you're going to begin to believe in yourself, and you'll begin to put things more and more together. If you're struggling with those successes, the stresses might show themselves up in the form of distress. And distress is the harmful form of stress that leads to negative physical and emotional responses. Those are those things where you begin to doubt yourself, where they begin to physically take their toll on your body in the forms of high blood pressure, heart issues, those kinds of things, and even mental wellness issues as well. So there's those two different types of stress should be distinguished. And remember, not all stress is bad. The stress that actually boosts us and kind of lifts us up is a good stress to have. But oftentimes this job takes the form of distress, which is the less pleasant version of stress. Wellness means actively working towards good physical, mental, and emotional health. So when we talk about wellness, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about you developing those things and working towards maintaining those things. Of course, resilience is your ability to handle stress and bounce back from difficult situations. The healthier you are, the more resilient you'll be. And I'm not just talking about mental health, I'm talking about physical health. If you're physically healthy, you're going to be a lot more resilient and you're going to be able to bounce back. So eating a healthy, balanced diet supports both physical and mental resilience, as well as getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep each night helps the body and mind recover. Of course, you guys are all just beginning your career in EMS, and you'll find out soon enough that, well, on the job, if you're working 12-hour or 24-hour shifts, there's a very good chance you might not get 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Strong relationships are also very helpful. So if you have close family and friends, these are going to help to improve your overall emotional strength and make you a lot more resilient to those stressful times that might start to bring you down and impact your wellness. Developing strong relationships with peers and coworkers can provide valuable support. So building those relationships with the people that you work with, kind of the birds of a feather approach, they're going to have a much better understanding of what it is that you're going through and the stresses that are put upon you. While you may have a great supporting network of family and friends, sometimes they don't really understand the stresses that you're under or that you're going through, and they're very well-meaning in their advice and their conversations with you. They just may not really understand. So teaming up with someone that understands, such as peers and coworkers, can be really helpful. Of course, getting some exercise, that daily movement, stretching, and even just regular exercise will be helpful in reducing stress and improving your overall physical and mental health as well. Exercise actually does improve your mental health. Practicing mindfulness and focusing on positivity can strengthen your mental resilience as well. So just developing some positive mindfulness and positive habits will be really, really helpful in getting you through some of those stressful situations. So some strategies to begin managing that stress. These management of stress typically involves using some proven strategies to reduce or even ideally eliminate stress. Reducing or removing the source of the stress is often the most effective first step. However, if the stress is because you just ran a call with a 5-year-old, excuse me, in cardiac arrest or something like that, well, that's not going to be possible to completely remove that stress. Sometimes, though, it's a little more environmental, that's local. Something like maybe being able to switch partners might be able to help if there is a work relationship that is negative or maybe even a bit hostile. If you can adjust your work hours, that might reduce the strain and improve your work-life balance, which maintaining a good work-life balance is very important. Changing your work environment can help you feel more comfortable and supported, and cutting back on overtime allows more time to rest, recovery, and personal well-being. There's always overtime to be had in EMS, and the money sometimes is very nice, a nice, good amount of money. Where the problem comes in is when EMTs become dependent on that overtime money and they get kind of stuck having to work those overtime hours. It creates a lot of stress because they have very limited downtime and very limited away time from work. It's really important to have enough away time from work so that your body and mind can heal and recuperate. Changing how you think about a particular stressor can also make that particular stressor easier to handle anyway. So referring back to the 5-year-old in cardiac arrest, one of the ways that I've found most effective for me to handle those situations is it's a terrible situation. You're always thinking about, the life ahead of this child and those kinds of things. But what you need to realize is you played no role in them getting to the point that they're at today, So that sometimes is a very helpful tool in helping you cope with that stressor or help how you view that stressor, because you played no role in that. You're just a reactionary force to whatever has occurred prior to you getting there. That sometimes makes those stresses easier to handle. Of course, talking with trusted friends and family or coworkers can help release some of that built up stress. It may not feel like it. It may feel like when you talk about it, the stress becomes worse or overwhelming, and you maybe even become emotional about it. But the truth is, just saying those things out loud can be extremely helpful. And of course, I always recommend seeing professional counseling, because this is a very healthy and effective way to cope when it's needed. And it doesn't necessarily, you don't need to wait until you're in crisis mode to seek out that professional counseling. I've known many medics that have a counselor that they see on a regular basis, just so they can keep the stress boogeyman away. So that's a really good approach to do that. It's just having that well-educated voice that you can talk to, and lay everything out to. Of course, it's really helpful to not dwell on things that are out of your control. Like I said, my biggest coping mechanism that I've had over the years was I just looked at it as I had no role in what happened here. I'm not responsible for what happened. I'm only responsible for things moving forward. I'm not in control of what happened before I got there. And that way it's easier for you to begin to focus on providing the best possible care that you can, instead of focusing on the situation. Adopting a calm, philosophical mindset can help you manage stress much more effectively. So it's really, really helpful to find that coping mechanism really early on. And of course, building that support network that includes people outside of your workplace as well, not just inside. People inside your workplace are going to have similar problems as you, so you need to have someone outside of your workplace, or have friends outside of your workplace. And then having friendships and hobbies that aren't connected to emergency services is really helpful too, just to kind of get away from it. Cutting back on caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, and all those kinds of things will help reduce their impact on your stress and overall health. Remember, the two are connected, so the healthier your body is, the healthier your mind will be. Eating regular, well-balanced meals to support your energy and overall health is really important. Keeping your intake of sugars, fats, sodium, and alcohol to a minimum. Focusing instead a little more on those complex carbohydrates that can provide more energy, similar to simple sugars, but they last much longer, and you don't have the glucose rebounds from those. So foods like pasta, rice, and vegetables are great sources of long-term energy. While fats can be used for energy, overabundance of fat can be a problem. It can increase the risk of obesity and lead to some kinds of different kinds of heart disease and those kinds of things. So you should stay well hydrated as well. Water is almost always the best option for maintaining a good fluid balance and energy levels. Regular exercise significantly enhances the benefits you gain from eating well and staying properly hydrated. And of course, being in good physical condition helps you maintain and manage those stress levels much more easily. Aim for at least 30 minutes of moderate or vigorous physical activity 5 days a week, making sure to include exercises that build cardiovascular endurance, muscle strength, and flexibility, because this is a physically demanding job at times. Yes, there has been innovations over the years that make some of the lifting and those kinds of tasks that were once completely physical much easier. However, it can still be a very physically demanding job, and oftentimes when you least expect it to be, so you need to be prepared for those inevitabilities. Both the National Sleep Foundation and the American Academy of Sleep Medicine recommend that adults get at least 7 to 9 hours of sleep each night. And I believe that's probably recommended almost by every health-related organization across the board. Unfortunately, half of all EMS personnel report sleeping less than 6 hours for every 24-hour period, leading to severe mental and physical fatigue. In the short term, not getting enough sleep can result in medical errors, vehicle crashes, and harm to patients, bystanders, or even other EMS providers. In the long term, sleep deprivation can lead to serious health issues like high blood pressure, sleep apnea, breathing problems, diabetes, and depression. Increased stress can also contribute to the problems that are related to sleep deprivation and fatigue. The U.S. Department of Transportation and the National Association of EMS Officials have developed evidence-based guidelines for managing fatigue. The tools should be used to measure and monitor fatigue and sleepiness among EMS personnel. EMS personnel should work shifts that are shorter than 24 hours is now the new recommendations. EMS personnel should have access to caffeine if needed to help combat fatigue. And EMS personnel should be given the chance to nap while on duty to help reduce these fatigue incidents. EMS personnel should receive education and training on how to reduce fatigue and manage its related risks. Unfortunately, not all fatigue is related to shift work. Sometimes as a young EMT, you want to go out and kick up your heels and, spend half the night, partying or doing those kinds of things that is going to increase the amount or the likelihood of fatigue going into the shift. And that's going to put every patient that you come into contact with at risk. So what's recommended is you make sure you get enough good quality sleep. When permitted by your employer, take short 20 to 30 minute naps or rest breaks while on duty. Increase your level of physical activity during your shift and be mindful of how much caffeine you're consuming. Engage in those mental exercises such as having a conversation, playing a game, those kinds of things to help kind of keep your mind active. Those will all really be really helpful in kind of combating that. Make sure, sorry, I'm looking at this and it didn't look like it changed. So yeah, make sure you avoid that caffeine or nicotine at least 4 hours before you go to bed. And have a good quality sleep environment. Dark, quiet, cool place to sleep so you can sleep comfortably. Have you ever tried to sleep, in a tent in the summertime, as a kid and it's sweltering hot, in the 80s and you can't get any rest? So having a nice cool place is really helpful. Exercise early and allow yourself time to relax before bedtime. Take naps earlier in the day if you're allowed to. Avoid heavy pre-sleep meals. Don't eat a big meal right before you go to bed. And make sure you balance your fluid intake. And of course, if you drink a bunch of water before you go to bed, you're probably going to be up again 1 or 2 times in the middle of the night. Establish a good relaxing routine before you go to bed. Only go to sleep when you are genuinely tired. Avoid watching the clock while you're in bed. It's kind of like when you're sitting in class waiting for class to end, you're watching the clock and it seems like it's never moving. Well, if you're watching the clock while you're in bed, it seems like it's moving twice as fast because you're like, oh, if I go to sleep now, I can get 6 hours of sleep. And, you blink your eyes and, now you only can get 4 hours. So try to keep your sleep schedule as consistent as you can. This really helps you, your body establish that routine of knowing when to shut down and when to relax. Whenever possible, get natural light exposure during the day to help maintain healthy sleep-wake cycles. So if you're working shift work and you're working overnight, it's still going to be helpful to get natural light exposure, even if you're before you go to bed, to sleep during the day. That'll help to maintain some normalcy in your sleep cycles. Disease prevention. When we talk about prevention and health promotion, we're primarily focused on medical care and proactive measures to lessen or avoid the impact of an illness or to an individual. Health promotion, on the other hand, centers on an individual's personal habits and social behaviors to improve their overall well-being. We're going to take a look at those. So, smoking, vaping, chewing nicotine, the use of any tobacco-related products can lead to serious cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses. When vaping came out, they thought it was the savior of all, for those that were smokers, and they thought, okay, well, this is a healthy alternative and it'll be fine, it'll be safe. Well, it is anything but. The other chemicals in that have turned out to be far more toxic than smoking. So vaping is not a good alternative. The use of smokeless tobacco is linked to cancers of throat, mouth, and even the pancreas. Of course, as I've mentioned, that vaping can cause cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses and diseases that were not seen before with regular smoking. So some strategies to help you quit can be things like developing a plan that addresses the challenges that might make you want to use the product, choosing a specific quit date, sharing your quitting plan with friends or family, getting rid of all tobacco and vaping products from your home, car, and workplace so it takes away the temptations. Talk to your doctor about other resources that could help you quit as well. There's several methods out there and even medications that can be used. There's several organizations that can actually help you quit as well. There's even some state-funded organizations that can help you quit tobacco as well. Except when it comes to alcohol, there's always going back and forth about what the acceptable consumption level is. At the time of this textbook, they're saying 1 drink for a female, 2 drinks for a male is acceptable, but that always seems to be changing, and sometimes it all just depends on what it is that you're drinking. According to the Centers for Disease Control, excessive alcohol use causes about 88,000 deaths a year in the United States, costing an average of around $200 billion each year. Roughly 75% of the total cost associated with alcohol abuse is due to binge drinking. So it's not from the regular alcoholics that are out there drinking, it's from binge drinking, like going to a party and drinking an excessive amount of alcohol. This excessive alcohol use can negatively affect your cardiovascular system, your liver, your immune, and even your central nervous systems, and can also increase your risk of developing cancers of the mouth, throat, breast, esophagus, and liver. So it's not a good thing, and it's not a good coping mechanism, and it's not a good viable source of self-medicating for your stresses that you have as an EMT. Both prescription and illegal or illicit drugs can be abused or misused. According to the CDC, drug abuse costs the United States about $190 billion a year due to loss of work productivity, health expenses, and crime. Many EMS agencies perform drug tests on their employees for both legal and prescription drugs. And it's important to point out here, I've mentioned before about, I believe I have, about medical marijuana and its use in EMS. Realize that the state law actually prohibits you from having a medical marijuana license and an EMS license. It pretty clearly states that if you have an EMS license, you can't have a medical marijuana license. But it's similar when we talk about prescription medications that may cause some kind of impairment. Just because you have a prescription for something doesn't mean you being impaired is acceptable or is okay. So it's not okay for you to be under the influence of a medication, even if it's a prescription medication, if it causes any kind of impairment on the job, especially if you're tasked with driving, the ambulance. So that's really important to keep in mind. So making it all work, it's whenever possible, you want to try to adjust your work schedule to allow for some personal time off. Typically, as a new EMT, that's the last thing you want. You want to run calls, and your family, has pictures of you on milk cartons because they haven't seen you for days and they think you're missing. It's still very important to balance that work-life time, and make sure you take vacations, get some time away. Don't wait until you've reached that point of no return before you say, I got to take some time off. You need to do that early when you still have a love for what you're doing and you're not overly stressed. Don't wait until you reach that stress point or your breaking point. Do it well before that while you love what you're doing. If you feel overwhelmed by work-related stress, of course, you need to make sure you reach out to somebody. You need to speak up and begin to deal with that stress before it builds up and reaches a breaking point. We always have to be concerned about infectious and communicable diseases. Of course, an infectious disease is caused by organisms that are already present within the body. However, a communicable disease has the ability to spread from one person to another or even one species to another. So they kind of go hand in hand, but not all together. Not every infectious disease is not necessarily communicable. So infection risk can be significantly minimized through getting things like immunizations, using proper protective techniques, which we're going to do a lot of. You'll learn a lot about that. One of the biggest ways that we can minimize the risk is simply just washing our hands. People don't do that near enough. I remember when COVID was first breaking out. I think it was somewhere around March or April. I was flying out of state somewhere, and typically when you would go into the bathrooms at the airport, you would have to wait in line in the men's room anyway, to get a stall or whatever, so you could do your business. But when it came time to washing your hands, I never had to wait in line. Well, it was funny because at this particular time when I flew, I went in and I didn't have to wait in line to go to the bathroom, but I had to wait in line to wash my hands. And I thought, whoa, what a switch. That just gives you an idea of how many people were not washing their hands when they were leaving the bathroom. So hand washing is a valuable tool in minimizing the risk of infection. Also, some important terms to understand that are going to be really, really helpful. These will be some of those terms that you're going to need to know. You're going to hear about them, throughout this course. So these might be really good if you haven't already started making you some flashcards. These would be a really, really good place to start. So basically you write the term on the front of the card and the definition on the back of the card, and then you can use them to quiz yourself with later. I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm just saying that it was really a really helpful tool for me in order to be able to learn and get these things down pat. So some terminology, and this is just a start of it, and you may already have some already done. But a pathogen is a tiny organism that can cause disease in someone who is susceptible to it. That's the definition of a pathogen. Contamination refers to the presence of infectious organisms or foreign substances on or within objects like dressings, water, food, needles, wounds, or even the patient's body. Exposure occurs when a person has come into contact with blood, bloody fluids, tissues, or airborne particles in a way that allows for disease transmission. And exposure doesn't necessarily mean that there's been a transmission, but exposure means that there's the possibility of it. Personal protective equipment, or PPE, this is very common terminology. We use the term PPE a lot. This is any equipment an individual wears to protect themselves from exposure to a pathogen or other hazardous material. This is like the gloves that we wear, the goggles, the face masks, the gowns, all those types of things. Nearly all of these are disposable. That's typically what we use. There are a few exceptions to that sometimes some of those things can be reused if they're cleaned properly, but nearly everything we use for personal protective equipment is disposable. But don't think of it just on the small scale of medical side of things. Personal protective equipment crosses all professions. For instance, firefighters have personal protective equipment in the form of bunker gear or turnout gear and SCBAs and those kinds of things. Theirs are clearly not disposable, but it is personal protective equipment. It's equipment that is specifically designed to protect us. For us as healthcare workers, it's mainly from exposure to pathogens and those kinds of things, but it could be from other hazards, such as hazardous materials or objects and those kinds of things that it may be protecting us from. Transmission, routes of transmission, when we're talking about different routes of transmission, this refers to the specific way an infectious disease is spread. So direct contact occurs when the pathogen is spread directly from person to person, such as with bloodborne pathogens. Indirect, these are terms, by the way, wink, wink, these are terms that would be really, really good to know for any kind of exam material. So I'm just saying, I'm not promising they're on an exam, but if I was making your exam, these might be some terms that I might use in some way. So indirect contact happens when a pathogen is spread through an inanimate object, such as needles or something like that, or contact with, by touching something or something like that. Airborne transmission involves pathogens spreading through the air, such as when someone sneezes or coughs, something like that. Foodborne is just like it says, when the disease is spread through contaminated food, such as listeria or any one of those other ones that are spread through food. Vector-borne, this is when a disease is spread by an animal or an insect, such as fleas, mosquitoes, ticks, those kinds of things that will spread those kinds of things. So these are all good routes of transmission to be familiar with and understand, because not necessarily because there's something that is commonly discussed or used as an EMT, but it's important to understand how a particular thing is spread. So when you're looking at a disease process or a route of transmission for, say, I'm trying to think, COVID-19, how that spread might, they're going to explain that as, it can be spread by, indirect contact, airborne transmission, or direct contact. So then you know how vulnerable you might be to that and what kind of personal protective equipment that you might need. For instance, tuberculosis, since it's airborne, you would want to make sure that you took not only contact precautions from touching the patient, although it's not really a direct contact spread, it's more airborne spread from the droplets, but you would want to wear a mask and probably put a mask on your patient. So that's why it's important to understand the routes of transmission and be familiar with them, so that, when necessary, you're able to protect yourself. So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, is responsible for developing, publishing, and enforcing guidelines to reduce all those workplace hazards. All EMTs receive training on how to handle bloodborne pathogens safely. The CDC has established standard precautions that healthcare workers should use when treating patients. Standard precautions are protective measures designed to prevent healthcare workers from coming into contact with objects, blood, bloody fluids, or other potential risks that could lead to germ exposures. The CDC's 2016 recommendation is to assume that every person might be infected or could be potentially spreaders of an organism in a healthcare setting. This means you should always apply infection control procedures to reduce the risk of transmission. OSHA refers to the same concept as universal precautions. And also, if you believe that you've been exposed, make sure you notify your designated officer. So there's a whole process so that if you actually get an exposure, a legitimate exposure, there's a whole process for what you need to follow in order to report that and what plays out after that, which is something we'll talk about in a later chapter. So this concept of universal precautions, and I was trying to see if they called it that there was another term that they use, standard precautions. So universal precautions, standard precautions are those things that we use with every single patient. And typically that involves gloves, wearing gloves. I can't recall hardly ever touching a patient with my bare hand. It was always a gloved hand. And that is that universal precautions. That works both ways though. Oftentimes we think that we're protecting ourselves from the patient, which is the biggest reason why we're doing it. But also we might be protecting the patient from us as well, making sure that we don't have something that we're spreading from the previous patient to this patient, or, those kinds of things. So it's really to reduce the risk of, spreading those infections and communicable diseases, from patient to patient, as well as exposing ourselves to them. So that's that universal precautions or standard precautions. Those two terms can be used interchangeably. They both mean exactly the same thing, universal and standard precautions. So you'll hear these weird little terms used like donning and doffing when it comes to PPE or personal protective equipment. So donning and doffing simply means when you don it, that means how you put it on. Donning means putting on personal protective equipment, and doffing means removal of that. So it's important that we put it on and take it off in a very specific, consistent order to minimize any risk of contamination. Now, donning or don and doff, when we don our PPE, it's less important how we do that in some ways, generally speaking. It's more important how we take it off. Now, I don't want you to think how we don our PPE is not important. It can be very important, especially if we have a patient that has something like reverse precautions, where we're putting on personal protective equipment, where we might put on gloves, a gown, and a mask, and a hat, and all of these things, but we're protecting that patient from us because maybe they're receiving some kind of immunosuppressive medication, or they're highly susceptible to disease or illness or anything like that because they're in a very critical state. So sometimes we put all that stuff on to protect the patient from us, more so than us being protected from them. So in those instances, how we don that or how we put on our PPE is important because we don't want to contaminate the outside of the PPE while we put it on. Now, the bigger thing is when we take off that PPE, this is where we really should have a very consistent routine way of doing things. That way, when we take it off, we're not exposing ourselves to that. We don't completely defeat the purpose of, having put those things on. Your instructor will show you in class some very specific ways that you can do that and ways that we can protect ourselves from exposure. Once you get those kind of down pat, they should become very routine. Of course, the more common things that we're going to use is going to be masks, eye protection, face shields, gloves and gowns, those kinds of things. And they're all things that you're going to get some experience with as you move through the EMT class, and you'll learn ways that we can do that. As I've mentioned before, good, proper hand hygiene is very, very important. It's the simplest yet most effective way to prevent the spread of disease that we oftentimes overlook. So as a healthcare provider, you should be very familiar with where the sink and the soap is in every emergency room, every place that you visit, and as well as at your own station, so that you can maintain that hygiene. Always wash your hands before and after patient contacts. It's not always practical before. Whether you're wearing gloves or not is irrelevant. You should always wash your hands. And if you don't have a sink available, of course you can use the liquid hand sanitizers and whatnot. But if you rely solely on those, you're probably going to want to keep some hand lotion around because those things dry your hands out. However, hand lotion is also will also help to promote bacteria and those kinds of things. So it's kind of a bittersweet thing. So, like I said, if you don't have running water, you can use the waterless substitutes. There's different kinds. This one happens to be a liquid waterless one. There's some foam ones and those kinds of things. But using those routinely and completely in place of hand washing is not always the best idea. So, universal precautions, standard precautions. You should always wear gloves if there's any chance you might get exposed to blood or body fluids. So that's going to be every single patient you come in contact with. There's a lot of different types of gloves out there. There's vinyl, there's nitrile, there's latex. They're all effective in protecting you. And you should use as heavy duty of a glove as you can get, especially when you're cleaning the ambulance. And, not necessarily the gloves that you take care of your patients with. I'm talking about the latex, big yellow latex gloves that, your mom uses when she's doing dishes. Those big, thick rubber gloves. That's what we should use when we're cleaning the truck to protect us from the chemicals that we use when we're cleaning the ambulance, because those are still absorbed through the skin, and some of them are not good things to absorb because they kill all things. So it's not good for them to be absorbed. Of course, you should change your gloves in between patients. You should always change your gloves in between patients. wash your hands and all that. But sometimes some scenes don't afford for that. So we're doing pretty good to change our gloves between patients regardless. But on days like today, it is late July in Oklahoma. It's about 100 and something outside. And if you're outside, it's not going to take any time before your hands are sweaty and all that stuff, and you pull your gloves off, and it's a nightmare trying to put gloves on wet hands. So in those instances, what a lot of medics will do is if they know they're going to have multiple patients, they'll put multiple gloves on, and then they can just pull a layer of gloves off in between patients when they move on to the next patient. Sometimes that'll get you through about 3 or 4 patients before you have to worry about how you're going to get your hands dry enough to put new gloves on. But wet hands do not, latex and vinyl and nitrile, all those gloves don't like wet hands. So also, I was going to point out that if you're allergic to latex, make sure your employer has either vinyl or nitrile. Most people don't really care for the vinyl ones. They're just awkward. They feel more like the ones they use in the cafeteria when they're serving food. The nitrile ones are typically a lot more comfortable, and we're seeing more and more of those. We don't see latex as often because some of our patients are allergic to latex too, and they have pretty significant reactions. So we need to make sure we take those gloves off properly, and there's a special technique that we can do to prevent contaminating ourselves with any of the materials that may be on the surface of the gloves. Like I talked about, your instructor's going to talk about how to do this. We'll probably talk about this again in a later chapter, and there's probably even a skill drill in your book about how to do this. But it's with that, it's kind of nice to be able to practice that, and you're going to be able to practice that to where that you can get that down pat. At first, it'll seem a little awkward, but then it'll get really comfortable really fast. So, eye protection and face shields. Wearing eye protection is essential. Because blood can splatter and all those kinds of things, especially in those scenes where there's blood or body fluid splashing around. Your eyes are much more absorbent to, for lack of a better term, much more absorbent to other people's fluids or blood or those kinds of things than any other part of your body, any of your skin and all that stuff. It's very absorbent, very porous. Things can be absorbed easily through the eyes. Please note that regular prescription glasses do not provide adequate protection. So prescription glasses don't protect the sides of your face and all that, the sides of your eyes from that. Either use a safety goggle or a full face shield for these instances. They even make goggles that'll go over your prescription glasses and those kinds of things. This guy right here, he's got just about everything on, all but the gown. But masks, eyewear, all that. 4 years ago during the height of COVID, this was pretty standard with every single patient that we were picking up at the time. So a little less so now, thank goodness. Gowns offer protection against large amounts of blood splatter and those kinds of things. You might put on a gown during a particular procedure that generates aerosols, or maybe when your partner's doing a procedure, when delivering a baby in the field, or in cases of major trauma. Basically, you're protecting your clothing. Otherwise, if your clothing gets contaminated, it's going to have to be washed. It's always, though, a good idea to bring an extra or have a change of clothing available. I typically would keep either extra clothes in my overnight bag for work or in my locker at work. That way, if I did have to change clothes, I could throw the batch that I was wearing in the washing machine and put on some fresh clothes and not worry about contaminating myself or the next patient that I went and took care of. So masks, respirators, barrier devices, there's tons of different kinds of masks out there. So if you're worried about just general splatters, you can wear a standard surgical mask. But if you're suspecting a patient has an airborne or droplet spread disease like tuberculosis, the flu, or even COVID-19, put a surgical mask on the patient and wear a particulate air respirator such as an N95 mask yourself. There was a lot of knockoffs that came out during COVID, a lot of knockoffs to the N95. The N95 is the only one that has that high level of rating for this. So N95 would be the gold standard, and they're a little pricey still. Not quite like they were, but they're still a little expensive, so you're not going to use them on every patient. But in those instances where you might need one, you're going to need to put it on. And a lot of employers require you to do fit testing so that you know how to make sure that mask is sealing properly. In these situations, of course, you might need protective eyewear like safety glasses and side shields, those kinds of things, or even a full face shield might be necessary. If the patient requires oxygen using a non-rebreather, you might use a non-rebreather instead of a surgical mask on the patient, and set the flow rate at 10 to 15 liters per minute. When using a particulate respirator, you must also follow OSHA guidelines to ensure that it's properly fitted, as I've mentioned before. So you'll go through a fit testing process to make sure that mask fits properly. For our paramedic students that they're required to do an N95 fit test every year. Each new batch is required to do that fit test, so that we make sure that they're well protected. When there is an active community spread of an airborne virus, mouth-to-mouth or mouth-to-mask resuscitation is not really recommended. However, bag valve mask ventilation creates aerosols, so it should be avoided in epidemic situations like those like COVID-19. So these all created some really, really tough issues for us to have to deal with. So, yes, we wind up avoiding mouth to mouth, and maybe even mouth to mask, or mouth to mask ventilations might be better than bag valve mask, bag mask ventilations. And you'll understand what both of the devices are. I know I'm talking about devices that you've never seen. Here's the pocket mask, and you see in the center of that pocket mask, you see the little green dot inside there. That's a one-way valve that kind of prevents air or anything coming back the other way. That's why these are beneficial. Whereas the bag valve mask, the ambu bag, the big bag thing that they squeeze when they're breathing for somebody, those can create aerosols because of the way they vent back into the atmosphere, which is usually the back of the ambulance. So those can be problematic in instances of epidemics like COVID-19 or those kinds of things, or if it's tuberculosis and all that. You need to make sure that you're wearing a properly fitted N95 mask in those instances to protect yourself. Of course, anytime there's sharps being used, we need to make sure that we prevent serious exposures and infections like HIV and hepatitis by correctly disposing of those in an approved container. We're never going to recap, break, or bend needles, do anything like that, because anytime you start doing that kind of nonsense, you wind up getting stuck, or somebody gets stuck. I've seen people on the other side of the ambulance get stuck because somebody was trying to do one of those things and the needle flew off. So don't ever do that. Always dispose of used sharps items in a container that is approved. It's closed, and of course it's rigid. They're going to be a hard plastic container, but that is still not a guarantee that a needle might poke through those things. So you should still use caution when using them. And it's important to understand that the risk of exposure to a communicable disease is an inherent part of the job. It's part of the hazard of the job. There's no guarantee of a risk-free environment in EMS. Not only to environmental hazards, such as things you might come across in a car wreck or those kinds of things, but exposure to communicable diseases is always a possibility, and it's always there. While it's unlikely because we're going to take the precautions that we should, we're going to follow those guidelines that we should follow from OSHA and other national guidelines to reduce our risk. The possibility is still there. Make sure that you know whatever your department's specific infection control plan is, and follow it anytime there's an exposure. Even if you suspect an exposure and you're not really sure if it counts as an exposure, go ahead and report it. Let your exposure control person determine whether or not it is a true exposure. So don't take any chances with that stuff, because sometimes if it is a true exposure, there's some things that can be done to kind of mitigate the risk or to reduce the risk, and also begin the treatment process if it happens to actually be a true exposure. So it's really important when it comes to infection control is establishing a routine. There's going to be times when you're tired, you're distracted, you've got a lot going on, you're running a call, those kinds of things where having a very particular routine is going to make it to where that you don't have to think about or put a whole lot of thought into it. Think about when you get up in the morning, you're getting dressed and all that stuff, and you put on your shoes, and you're putting on your shoes while maybe watching TV or something like that. You don't have to think about the process of actually tying your shoes. It's a natural process. That's what you need to get to the point where infection control is, and your routine to that is. So you need to start out being very consistent in how you do that so that it develops a routine. Then you should make sure that you clean the ambulance after every run and at the end of each day to ensure that nothing was missed. And, yes, we want to protect the patients that we're putting in the back of the ambulance, but we also want to protect you and make sure we're keeping you safe. And one of the ways that we can do that is to make sure that our ambulance and our equipment is clean. Whenever possible, we want to try to do that cleaning at the hospital. And of course, Chapter 38 is going to talk a lot more about the process for this and kind of all the ins and outs of it during that chapter on transport operations. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about the process of cleaning the truck and disinfecting it. Of course, then any medical waste must be placed in the red biohazard bags and disposed of at the hospital. The hospital will take those bags and they'll either turn them over to another company, or some hospitals still, dispose of their own medical waste. But typically it's done by incineration. They burn that stuff so that they burn off anything living in them. Contaminated equipment left at the hospital should either be cleaned by hospital staff or placed in a red bag for transport back to the station for cleaning. We're going to use probably one of the best, most effective means, and it's the most affordable means, is a 10-to-1 bleach solution with bleach and water solution to clean the truck. It is effective. However, it's only effective if you allow the bleach a little bit of time to work. Spraying it and immediately wiping it off doesn't really do the trick. Spray it, let it set for 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever, before you begin to wipe that down. It's going to be really, really effective. Of course, a 10-to-1 bleach solution for people is not good, so we have other things that we use for that. So don't go spraying your partner down because they've been exposed. Don't spray them down with a 10% bleach solution. There are some hospital-approved disinfectants out there that are very effective against different types of microorganisms that we can use. Just realize that those are designed to kill microorganisms, and they are generally not safe to be on people, and they're not made to be on people. So if you have something that is a disinfectant for cleaning equipment or trucks or hospital beds and that kind of stuff, it's not designed for people. Remove contaminated linen, place it in an appropriate bag for handling so that the linens can be cleaned. Reusable medical equipment needs to be cleaned thoroughly and sterilized according to your department standards, standard operating procedures of how that should be done and what you're going to use to clean it with. Not every piece of equipment can necessarily be cleaned by the exact same kind of cleaner. You may have a specific cleaner for a particular piece of equipment and other cleaners for other, you're not going to have 2 different cleaners, but you might have a couple of different cleaners. One's used for one, one's used for another thing. So realize that. It's just to keep from damaging that equipment. Some of the equipment's pretty sensitive. Even if the germs get to you, it doesn't automatically mean that you're going to get infected. Just because you picked up a patient with tuberculosis and you were around them without a mask on before you and your partner realized, oh, hey, they might have tuberculosis, and you masked up, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get tuberculosis. Your own bodily immunity plays a big role in determining which of those organisms get through and which ones don't. And that's why it's really important to stay healthy, physically, mentally, and all that, because all that's tied together. The healthier your body is, the healthier your mind is, the stronger your immune system's going to be, and the more likely it is you're going to be able to stave that off. I'll be honest with you, EMTs and paramedics are some people, emergency room nurses and physicians fit in this category as well, are some of the people with the most resilient and strongest immune systems, because they have ultimately been exposed to a lot, but you rarely see them get a cold or the flu or anything like that, because their immune system is so strong that they've developed over the years. So early on, yeah, you might get a cold or two, from your patient eventually, but your immune system will strengthen and that'll go away. But generally speaking, you'll be protected from many of these because of the strength of your immune system. Of course, immunity means you either have been immunized or vaccinated against that germ, or that you are able to recover from an infection caused by that particular germ. So you either have been vaccinated or you've had a previous exposure to that. Some of these, though, realize that your immunity to these will fade over time. That's why they do flu shots every year, and things such as that, is because your immunity to some of these particular ones will fade over time, and it makes you susceptible to them again. So it's important to keep a record of all your childhood diseases, such as chickenpox, mumps, measles, rubella, whooping cough, and all that stuff. All of those immunization records. The CDC actually recommends that all healthcare workers have had the hepatitis B vaccination, get a yearly flu shot, have had the MMR shots, measles, mumps, rubella. They've either had the vaccine against chickenpox or proof that they've had chickenpox as a child. The tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, or Tdap booster every 10 years. Realize this is a recommendation by the CDC. This recommendation changes. I'm not kidding you. Their recommendations change as often as you change socks. I'm not kidding you. They seem to change all the time. But different facilities, different employers will have different regulations on this, and many of them require 2 MMRs or 2 varicellas and those kinds of things. So realize that this is not an exclusive list of exactly how things are, and it's in no way reflective of what our program here requires. Our program does require many of these, but in different quantities, and we don't accept a history of chickenpox, so there's some differences there. So. And of course, TB skin tests are often required too, which that's changing as well. It was the same for many years, 25, 30 years that I know of. And now that is changing a little bit too. So we don't have to do those quite as often. So what do you do if you get exposed? So if you're exposed to a patient's blood or body fluids, follow these steps. Transfer the patient care to another EMS provider. Thoroughly clean the exposed area with soap and water. If your eyes were exposed, don't use soap, but rinse them with water for 20 minutes. Or do use soap, because that'll encourage you to rinse them for 20 minutes with water. No, I'm kidding. Don't put soap in your eyes. I can just hear you out there going, well, my EMT instructor said I put soap in my eyes. No, I didn't. I didn't say that. So activate your department's infection control plan. So notify that the person that's in charge of infection control. Sometimes some places actually refer you to the hospital and let the infection control person at the hospital deal with that. You will need to complete an exposure report and undergo screening to determine if there was a significant exposure to a bloodborne pathogen or not. If you were exposed to a highly communicable airborne disease such as COVID without proper PPE, you might be required to quarantine for a specific period of time. We still see this happen from time to time. Same with the flu. Require you to quarantine at least for the length of the incubation period of that. And if there's no signs or symptoms, go back to business as usual. Post-exposure prophylaxis and treatment may be necessary after a significant exposure, but that's really going to depend on what it was you were exposed to. I know a couple of times in my career I've been exposed to bacterial meningitis. Transported a couple of patients, in the enclosed box of the ambulance, making it's a significant risk because it is airborne, and it is a very serious form of meningitis. So they just treated us with antibiotics, even though we showed no signs and symptoms. But the goal is to prevent any of that bacteria from taking shop and making it to our spinal cords and causing us meningitis. So, all right. So this chapter is actually broken down into two parts. You're going to see a few chapters like this. Some of the bigger chapters will break them down. That way, each one of the lectures for these, we try to keep them to roughly an hour. So we'll break these down a little bit so they're not quite as long and they're a little bit easier for you to digest in sections. So this particular chapter is broken down into two sections. So this is the end of part 1, and I will see you guys back in part 2.